Well, if you've driven a classic vehicle that's in a proper state of tune, including the air conditioning system, one of the things that you probably can appreciate is the old car vintage air conditioning. A lot of the times, the air conditioning in these old cars, when it's charged properly on the original refrigerant, which is an R12 refrigerant, actually blows colder air than modern air conditioning systems. And I have to say that some of the best air conditioning systems were made by General Motors. You can see here in this picture from my 1973 Cutlass, the General Motors A6 air conditioning compressor there on the passenger side of this Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch V8. That compressor was pretty much universally used by General Motors until the late 1970s when they switched to a pancake radial style compressor that wasn't quite as good, had more seal leaks in general than this A6 compressor. But the A6 compressor was so awesome that Ford even ended up switching to it beginning in the 1972 model year on Lincolns, and then it would eventually proliferate more of the Ford lineup as, I guess, customers enjoyed the six-piston air conditioning refrigeration as opposed to what Ford was using before, the kind of two-piston York-Tecumseh style design that many others used. Chrysler had its own air temp system, a V-twin style compressor that was also quite good and frigid. And in general, let's just say that classic car air conditioning, particularly I would say in the early and mid-1970s, or if you had a General Motors vehicle, even the 1960s, was just absolutely stellar. So what in the world happened? How do we go from these air conditioning systems that could put out extremely cold levels of air and cool cabins very quickly to what we have today, which is that you turn the air conditioning system on and it blows cold air, but it's not icy cold and frigid cold? Well, there's a number of things that changed. The first thing that I'm going to lament is the placement of the air conditioning outlet vents, because take a look at this photo from an early 70s Pontiac, and you'll notice that there are not only the outlets that are in the top portion of the instrument panel, but look beneath the steering column as well as beneath the glove box, and you see two little vents there that also will blow out cold air when you have the air conditioning turned on. There's a beloved name for these vents that you can see here on this 1970 Electra instrument panel that's beneath the dash. But I'll have somebody put that in the comment section as opposed to saying it. But regardless, you had, as I mentioned, not only the upper instrument panel vents, but you had these lower vents, and that really helped the in-cabin air circulate. And, well, if you were sitting there, you certainly felt cool. This Buick, by the way, has the Buick automatic climate control system, too, where there's no specific temperature setting. It just says cool and warm. It is actually automatic temperature control, but for whatever reason, they elected not to put degrees on the control itself. Now, one thing that's interesting is that GM really was the company that predominantly had those lower vents. Chrysler here, you can see, this is my dearly departed 1972 New Yorker, had 4 air conditioning outlet vents, 2 that are on the lower portion of the dash, and then 2 that are in the middle in the upper portion. And this worked just fine. The air conditioning on these vehicles was nice and cold. There actually were little openings in the ductwork on the underside of the dash that you could open if you wanted some cool air, like bleed air, to come out near your feet. And I sometimes had those open, but I didn't find that they did too much, so I often closed them off. But the Chryslers had, I think, lower positioned air vents during this time frame, and so they didn't have the same vents that you saw in the General Motors vehicles, and Ford, for whatever reason, just didn't put them on their cars either in general. So GM was the one that was the frequent purveyor of those vents. But aside from the interesting venting or outlets on the classic car air conditioning, there are some other reasons why classic car air conditioning was so awesome. Here, by the way, you can see the Chrysler V-twin air temp compressor on my 72 New Yorker that helped blow icy cold air. One of the principal reasons is that the refrigerant that was used during this time frame was R12 refrigerant, is what it was called. And this refrigerant had beautiful properties in terms of the overall temperatures that it could achieve on the high side and the low side. And it enabled the evaporators to get extremely cold very quickly. It was just a wonderfully efficient style refrigerant. And unfortunately, it was not environmentally friendly. And so it was sunset in the mid-1990s, and R134A replaced it, which in general was not as great of a refrigerant. Today they have, I believe it's 1234YF refrigerant, which is actually a flammable refrigerant that's used in vehicles because even R134A was deemed not to be environmentally safe. So the refrigerant and the properties of it, the R12, is something that really gave the cars an ability to get super cold air conditioning. In fact, often when you recharge these old systems on R134A, if you're using the new refrigerant and you retrofit them, they don't blow quite as cold as they did when they were on the R12 setup. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but I have actually never had one blow colder on R134A than it did on R12. They just can be as cold or even a little bit warmer. I find particularly the GM style setups, for whatever reason, when you recharge those with R134A, it doesn't tend to be as cold as the R12. So refrigerant is one reason behind the, let's say, cooling systems not putting out as cold of air as they used to. Another, I think, is actually designed in, and while a lot of us love the icy cold air conditioning blowing in our face from the old cars, that actually was something that a lot of customers didn't care for, that the air conditioning was too cold, and to the point that the evaporator sometimes would get too cold that you'd actually get icing on the evaporator after some period of time. And that's obviously not a desirable condition. So I believe now that modern air conditioning systems are designed purposefully so that the outlet temperature of the air is not cold enough that it allows the evaporators to freeze over. So it's good and bad. It means that the outlet temperature isn't quite as cold, but it also means then that the evaporator can't really freeze over. So good and bad on that one. And yet another reason why modern air conditioning systems aren't quite as good is that, well, those old air conditioning systems really just were very powerful, but they took a lot of power from the engines to basically run them. That GM A6 style compressor was not something that just took no horsepower from the engines to run. It sapped quite a fair amount of power, and that's one of the reasons why GM would change to the radial style compressor in the late 1970s, because it didn't take as much power and it was lighter weight. Now everything is about lightweighting on cars, including the compressors themselves. And you also want a compressor that doesn't take away all that much engine power. So they've really designed the systems to be much more efficient and to have less power draw on the engine than the old ones did. Who cared on the old ones when you had a big V8 engine oftentimes that had tons of torque, and nobody cared much about gasoline prices back in the day. So when you put the air conditioning on, you really didn't notice any drop in horsepower. But as engines got smaller and smaller and less powerful, well, it required the use of a different air conditioning compressor, in part because the engines would have a noticeable decrease in power when the air conditioning compressor was on. And so for these reasons, as well as one that everybody who's watching this video is well aware of, and that is cost. The air conditioning systems in today's cars are just different from those of the older vehicles. I tend to like the super frigid air blowing in my face. I actually enjoy that. I don't think a lot of customers did. But if you want that experience, you're just going to have to get a car that has one of these R12 refrigerant air conditioning systems as opposed to something newer. What do you think? Do you like the new car air conditioning systems or prefer the old car air conditioning systems? And what do you think about those lower vents that I showed to start this video that General Motors often employed on their air condition equipped cars? Let me know. Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.